In the late autumn of 1944, when Europe lay shattered beneath a gray sky, the roar of engines had become the continent's heartbeat. German armor still moved with precision across ruined landscapes, though the rhythm of the war had shifted. What once had been confident thunder, the sound of tigers and panthers advancing through French fields, had become a cautious, uncertain hum. The Reich's armored divisions were no longer hunters. They had become prey. But deep within those broken forests and fog-covered hills, German tank crews still believed they owned the battlefield. Their confidence was carved from years of victory, from Poland, from France, from the endless steppe of the Eastern Front. To them, the Tiger was more than a machine. It was a fortress of iron and pride, a symbol that no Allied gun could shatter. They had heard rumors of new American tanks, fast and light, but they dismissed them as propaganda. The Germans knew the Americans relied on numbers, not brilliance. They believed armor was about weight, about steel, about the echo of an 88mm shell finding its mark. They believed, until the shadow came. In December 1944, as the snows of the Ardennes began to fall, a new whisper entered the battlefield. A sound the Germans could not place. It wasn't the deep, thunderous growl of a Sherman's engine, nor the grinding march of infantry armor. It was something sharper, quicker, the low, racing hum of an engine tuned not for power, but for speed. It came and vanished like a ghost, striking before the German gunners could even rotate their turrets. What they did not yet know was that this sound belonged to America's most daring creation, the M18 Hellcat. Born from desperation and innovation, the Hellcat was unlike anything the world had seen. Where the Germans built armor to endure, the Americans built it to outrun. The M18's engineers at Buick understood a truth few others did. In a battlefield ruled by heavy armor, speed could be deadlier than steel. The Hellcat could reach nearly 60 miles per hour, the fastest armored fighting vehicle of the Second World War. Its 76mm gun could pierce the sides of a Panther at 800 meters, yet it weighed half as much. But its armor was paper-thin. A single well-placed shot could tear it apart. The Hellcat's survival depended on something far more dangerous, audacity. And so, in the forests of the Ardennes, where snow muted every sound but the heartbeat of engines, German tank crews began to face something they couldn't explain. They had grown used to the slow advance of Shermans, the steady rhythm of artillery, the predictable American doctrine. But this was different. Hellcats did not fight from the front. They moved like predators in the underbrush, appearing from nowhere, firing, and then vanishing before the Germans could even react. The first recorded encounter came near Bastogne. A German Panther commander, Oberleutnant Karl Riese, led his platoon along a narrow forest road when his radio operator caught a faint echo, the sound of something fast, flanking. Riese dismissed it at first. "American trucks," he said, though his words carried the edge of doubt. Then came the flash. From a ridge just beyond the tree line, an armor-piercing shell streaked through the air. Swift, silent, almost invisible against the white fog. It struck the Panther's side with surgical precision. One explosion, then silence. Riese's men had no time to turn their turret. The hit had come from 1,000 meters away, a distance at which few American tanks could dream of striking effectively. The survivors swore they never saw what hit them. Only later did German recovery crews find the tracks, light, narrow, and fast. "Nicht Panzer," one engineer wrote in his log. "Jagdpanzer? Nein, etwas Neues. Not a tank, not a tank destroyer, something new." Within days, word began spreading among German armor divisions. A phantom vehicle, fast as wind, unseen until the moment it struck. It was said to move between trees like a ghost. Some believed it was a new British invention. Others thought it an American trick. But when German intelligence recovered fragments of its spent shells, they realized something far more unsettling. These were not standard Sherman rounds. The casing bore the mark of a 76mm high-velocity gun, one unknown to their reports. By then, the Hellcat crews had already mastered their craft. They worked in silence, using the terrain as their ally. American commanders ordered them to engage only from ambush, to move, strike, and disappear. The M18s hunted in pairs, often beside the more famous Shermans, but unlike their slower cousins, they never stayed still. In open ground, they were suicidal targets. But in the winding wooded valleys of Belgium and Luxembourg, they became ghosts. German tankers who once laughed at the light armor of their enemies now found themselves burning before they could even align their crosshairs. In one battle near the village of Neuville, German panzers advanced under heavy mist. The lead Tiger, a behemoth of steel and dread, pushed forward through the haze, its guns sweeping left and right. The crew's confidence was absolute. But then a distant echo, a single shot. It sliced through the fog, hitting the Tiger's flank at a near-perfect angle. The great machine shuddered, then erupted into flame. The German radio chatter exploded with confusion. "From where?" one voice cried. But there was no answer. The second Tiger turned its turret too late. Another shot, another flash, then silence. When the fog cleared, the Germans saw the truth. Two small vehicles, barely armored, already gone. Only their tracks remained, carved into the frost. Those who survived that morning described the feeling as something new. Not defeat, but disorientation. It wasn't just that the Americans had built a faster tank. It was that they had changed the rules of armored warfare itself. German doctrine, forged in the fires of Blitzkrieg, was built upon control, the predictability of tactics, the strength of formation, the confidence of superior armor. But now, for the first time, the battlefield had become unpredictable. They were facing an enemy that refused to fight by their rhythm. As winter deepened and the Battle of the Bulge raged on, the name Hellcat began circulating in whispers across the German front. Crews spoke of it not as a machine, but as a presence, something that struck from nowhere, that punished arrogance with silence. Veterans who had survived years of combat began to feel a subtle dread each time they entered the forests. For every rustle in the trees, for every flicker of movement, they wondered, is that the shadow? American tank destroyer battalions, armed with Hellcats, had earned a reputation for doing the impossible. Near the town of Trois Ponts, they ambushed an entire German armored column, destroying half a dozen tanks before disappearing into the mist. Their speed allowed them to hit, relocate, and strike again before German gunners could even sight their positions. It was as though the battlefield itself was moving against the Germans, alive, reactive, unpredictable. The psychological toll was immense. German commanders, once confident in their invincible Tigers and Panthers, began issuing new orders. Do not advance through wooded terrain without infantry. They had never written such warnings before. The fear of the unseen had crept into their doctrine, but for all its brilliance, the Hellcat was no miracle. Its armor was so light that even machine gun fire could cripple it. Many crews died in flame, their bravery buried under their own speed. Yet their courage was unmatched. To fight in a Hellcat was to play chess with death, a game where a single misstep meant annihilation. And still they drove forward, trusting their engines more than their armor, and their instincts more than their orders. One American commander wrote in his diary, "We are not hunters, we are lightning. Here one moment, gone the next." By early 1945, when Germany's armored divisions were collapsing under Allied pressure, the reality had settled in. The Third Reich had built tanks for a past that no longer existed. Slow, massive, terrifying machines that could crush anything in their path, except time itself. The war had evolved beyond their reach. The Hellcat had proven that mobility, not mass, would define the battlefield of the future. For the Germans, it was more than a tactical defeat. It was an existential one. In their bunkers and command posts, officers whispered of a future they could not win. A war where speed, technology, and innovation outpaced ideology and will. In the aftermath, when the war finally ended and the wrecks of armor lay scattered across Europe like iron tombstones, the Hellcat remained a symbol, not of destruction, but of adaptation. It was a reminder that even in chaos, intelligence could outmatch strength. German veterans who later spoke of that winter often recalled the same moment. The flash, the silence, the sudden realization that the battlefield had changed forever. They remembered the shock, not of being defeated by power, but of being outthought. One survivor wrote decades later, "We did not lose to their tanks. We lost to their minds." As the years passed and the forests of the Ardennes grew silent again, the echoes of that battle faded into history. The world moved on, the tanks rusted, and the names of the men who drove them were lost. Yet in some forgotten field, beneath layers of earth and frost, there still lies the ghost of that encounter, the place where the shadow of the M18 Hellcat first crossed the vision of a German tanker, and everything they believed about war changed in an instant. In the silence that followed, the battlefield remembered. And if you listen closely beyond the wind, beyond the whisper of leaves, you might still hear it, the low hum of an engine, swift as lightning, vanishing into history. Because in that fleeting shadow, the world saw not just a new weapon, but the future of warfare itself. As the day turned to dusk, the battlefield lay eerily quiet, broken only by the groans of metal and the distant rumble of retreating engines. For many German crews, that evening was the first time they felt true uncertainty settle into their bones. Reports came flooding in from the front. Fast enemy tanks sighted near Nancy. Unidentified American armored unit capable of outflanking our lines. Commanders dismissed the first few accounts as exaggerations. Surely no Allied tank could outmaneuver the vaunted panzers. The German war machine had built its reputation on precision, speed, and armor, qualities that had crushed Europe under its treads. But as darkness fell, something had changed. The myth of German invincibility was beginning to crack. In the fog-draped valleys of France, the M18 Hellcat, slim, fast, almost ghost-like, was carving its legend into history. The M18 was unlike anything the Germans had encountered. It was not a heavy tank, nor did it rely on thick armor. Instead, it moved with the speed of an animal that knew how to kill before being seen. Built by Buick, the Hellcat was the fastest armored fighting vehicle of World War II, capable of reaching over 55 miles per hour. An absurd speed in an era where tanks lumbered like beasts trapped in mud. Its open turret left its crew exposed, yet it symbolized confidence, the kind of daring that belonged to those who refused to fear. To the Germans, this defied logic. They had been trained to believe superiority came from mass, from thickness of steel, from firepower and precision. But the Americans had introduced something different, velocity as a weapon. The Hellcat didn't fight the Tiger on its terms. It rewrote the terms entirely. The first encounters were brutal lessons. Near Aricourt in September 1944, when the fog lifted over Lorraine, the Germans advanced with dozens of Panthers and Panzer-Rifles. Their orders were simple: crush the American lines. But hidden beyond the tree line, in defilade positions and behind shattered barns, Hellcats lay in wait. They were so quiet, their engines muted by distance, that the German tanks never saw the strike coming. When the first shot rang out, it was like lightning cracking open the morning. An M18 76mm gun tore through a Panther's side armor. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the battlefield was chaos. German commanders shouted through radio static as Hellcats repositioned, fired, and vanished again before the Panzers could even turn their turrets. The once sure rhythm of the blitzkrieg had been reversed. The hunters had become the hunted. Those who survived described it as a haunting. The Hellcat struck from places no tank should have reached in time. It appeared on flanks that were thought impossible to breach. Crews reported seeing only the shimmer of its silhouette before the flash of its muzzle tore through the gloom. It moved like a phantom, one captured German officer later said, and then the sky would light with fire. The M18 didn't rely on armor to protect it. It relied on speed and surprise, darting in and out of cover with terrifying accuracy. German tankers, used to slugging it out in prolonged duels, suddenly found themselves in a kind of war they did not understand. Every second of hesitation meant death. Every pause to aim meant another Hellcat was already behind them. American doctrine had quietly evolved. Rather than meeting German armor head-on, the U.S. Army's tank destroyer battalions were designed to strike fast, fade, and strike again. They called it shoot and scoot. It was not the traditional honor-bound duel between tanks. It was surgical, ruthless efficiency. The Germans, still loyal to old tactics, were slow to adapt. The open fields of Lorraine, dotted with hedgerows and broken towns, became a graveyard for their armor. Burning wrecks marked the places where German pride collided with American innovation. The panzers that once thundered across Europe now sat broken, silent, their crews lost to the smoke and fire. Inside each Hellcat, the story was different. The American crews knew they were exposed. They had no heavy armor to save them from a direct hit. The thin steel around them could barely stop rifle fire. Yet what they lacked in protection, they replaced with precision and courage. Many of these men were barely out of their teens, mechanics, farmers, factory workers turned tank hunters. They relied on instinct, teamwork, and the belief that speed could cheat death. When the order came to engage, they didn't hesitate. The gunner steadied his breath, the commander whispered ranges and directions, and the driver pushed the throttle until the wind screamed past the open turret. Every kill meant they had cheated the odds again. Every hit from the enemy reminded them how fragile their lives were inside that thin shell of steel. As the campaign wore on, German intelligence finally began to piece together what they were facing. Reports labeled the new American vehicle as extremely fast, light, and deadly. Still, disbelief lingered among the higher ranks. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored warfare, had long championed mobility, but even he would have been astonished at the Hellcat's philosophy. Speed over armor, agility over fear. For a military built on rigid hierarchy and doctrine, the concept seemed almost heretical. And yet as the months passed, the evidence became undeniable. Entire panzer formations were being ambushed and annihilated by small, agile American units that moved faster than any reconnaissance could track. By late 1944, the psychological impact was as significant as the physical losses. German tank crews began to dread open terrain. They moved slower, hesitated longer, double-checked every shadow. Fear had seeped into their discipline. In the smoky distance, every flicker of movement could be another Hellcat. It was as if the very landscape had turned against them. The forests whispered with engines. The fog carried echoes of engines that weren't there. The once proud panzer divisions, the armored spearheads of Hitler's conquests, now stumbled under the weight of doubt and exhaustion. The war that once promised glory had turned into a test of endurance, and the Americans, with their relentless energy and innovation, were winning that test. When winter arrived, the Hellcats fought not just the enemy, but the elements. Snow and ice froze the tracks, visibility dropped to nothing, and yet they pressed on. In the Battle of the Bulge, when the Germans launched their final desperate counteroffensive, the M18s once again became the unseen guardians of collapsing lines. They darted through forests, ambushed convoys, and stalled advances long enough for reinforcements to arrive. It was not their firepower alone that saved positions. It was their timing, their audacity, their refusal to be still. Every engagement was a deadly dance of motion and instinct. American crews learned to listen for the faint rumble of approaching armor, to read the wind, to strike and disappear like smoke in the wind. By 1945, the end was drawing near. The M18 Hellcat had earned its legend, not because it was invincible, but because it made others feel vulnerable. It taught the German army that war was not only about strength, but about speed, strategy, and the will to adapt. In the ruins of once mighty cities, as German tanks lay rusting beside the roads they once conquered, the shadow of the Hellcat lingered. It had come like a whisper and left like a storm. In the aftermath, veterans on both sides would remember the same thing. Not the numbers, not the maps, but the sound. The sudden rising growl of an engine that meant death was already near. For German crews, it was the sound of their invincibility breaking. For American crews, it was the sound of purpose, the belief that no matter how powerful the enemy, they could outthink, outfight, and outrun them. And so, when history looks back on the wars of machines, when it recounts the thunder of Tigers and the fury of Shermans, the M18 Hellcat remains something else entirely. It was not the heaviest, nor the most armored, but it carried something greater, the audacity to challenge the very idea of how wars were fought. In the silence that followed the last battle, when the fires cooled and the metal stopped screaming, those who survived spoke softly of what they had seen. The Germans had once believed no one could catch them, no one could outflank them, no one could strike faster than they could react. But on that day, when they first saw the shadow of the M18 Hellcat racing through the fog, they realized the truth too late. The age of the hunter had ended, and the era of the fast had begun. As Europe lay scarred and smoldering in the early months of 1945, echoes of the M18 Hellcat's thunder still haunted the men who had faced it. The once dominant panzer crews, who had rolled across Poland, France, and Russia with unstoppable force, were now shadows of their former selves. The survivors of those tank battles carried the memory of a sound that struck before sight, of death that arrived not as a slow approach but as a blur of movement and fire. For them, the war had changed forever the moment they saw the Hellcat's silhouette cut across the smoke. Swift, low, and mercilessly silent until the flash of its gun announced the end. German intelligence records recovered after the war revealed an unsettling shift in field reports. Tank commanders, once confident and unflinching, began using words like unseen, swift, and ghost-like. It was as if the enemy they faced was no longer mechanical but spectral. They had been trained to battle equal opponents, armored beasts like themselves, Panther against Sherman, Tiger against Churchill. But the Hellcat was something else entirely, an opponent that refused to play the same game. Its crews turned the rules of armored warfare upside down, using speed as armor, surprise as defense, and intelligence as their greatest weapon. In the ruins of abandoned villages, American engineers studied the results of each engagement. The ground told its story: blackened craters, burnt-out panzers, the faint metallic smell of destruction. They measured impact angles, noted penetration points, and saw that speed had allowed the Hellcat to deliver fatal strikes even against superior armor. At close range it was fragile, but from the right position and distance it was untouchable. It was a paradox, a tank destroyer that survived not by absorbing blows but by never being hit at all. This principle would influence military design for decades to come, long after the guns of World War II fell silent. Across Europe, stories of the M18 spread among Allied forces. Infantrymen spoke of it with reverence. They said the Hellcats arrived when hope was fading, roaring down muddy roads, engines screaming, their white stars flashing through the haze. "When you heard them," one soldier wrote in his journal, "you knew we had a chance." To the men trapped in foxholes, those sleek, fast machines were symbols of American resilience, proof that courage wasn't measured in armor thickness, but in the willingness to move forward even when one shot could end it all. But for the Germans, those memories were far darker. One officer described a night near Metz when his unit was ambushed by what he first thought was a flight of aircraft. The speed was so impossible, he assumed air support had arrived. But the flashes came from the ground, Hellcats tearing through his flanks in a blur of dust and fire. His words, later found in his field diary, were chilling. "They came like wind through a broken gate, and before we could turn, my men were gone." Each encounter chipped away at the psychological armor of the German army. They were fighting an enemy that didn't just outnumber them, it outmaneuvered them. Even when the Hellcats were few, their presence was multiplied by the fear they inspired. Radios crackled with warnings. "Fast enemy tanks in the west." They strike and vanish. Every road, every hedgerow became a potential ambush. The Germans, once masters of surprise, now lived in constant suspense, never knowing when the next flash of light would signal their end. In the months that followed, as the Allies pushed toward the Rhine, the M18 Hellcat continued its relentless pursuit. It became a symbol of momentum, of war's unstoppable evolution. Cities like Cologne, Frankfurt, and Bonn would fall in part because the Hellcats helped clear the way, silencing strong points, destroying enemy armor before it could regroup. They weren't just weapons. They were instruments of inevitability. Every time one appeared on the horizon, it carried with it the weight of Allied progress, the unstoppable forward motion of history itself. And yet, behind the glory lay sacrifice. The Hellcat crews knew how fragile they were. They called their vehicles cardboard coffins, half joking, half resigned. Many never returned from their missions. When a shell struck true, there was no armor to save them. Some were burned alive in seconds. Others vanished into smoke and silence. Their bravery lay not in surviving, but in moving forward, knowing how thin the line was between victory and oblivion. For every German tanker who saw the shadow of a Hellcat and felt dread, there was an American inside that machine feeling the same fear, but refusing to yield to it. After the war, when historians gathered to dissect the machines that defined the conflict, the Hellcat stood apart. It wasn't the strongest or the most famous, it was something subtler, more human. It represented adaptation, creativity, and daring under pressure. The Germans had built weapons of terror, crafted for domination and endurance. The Americans built a weapon of speed, crafted for opportunity and freedom of movement. That difference reflected the philosophies of the nations themselves. One sought control, the other sought momentum. Even decades later, when veterans of both sides were old and gray, the memories didn't fade. At reunions, former German officers would quietly mention the fast ones, the hellish cats, their voices dropping into something between respect and regret. American veterans would nod, remembering the nights when they'd raced through rain and smoke, hearts pounding, fingers trembling on the trigger, knowing that their speed was their only armor. In documentaries and memoirs, the same image returned again and again, a battlefield shrouded in mist, the faint hum of engines, and then a shadow racing through the fog, too fast to track, too sudden to stop. The M18 Hellcat wasn't just a weapon. It was a moment in time, a fleeting glimpse of what war had become by 1944, mechanized, psychological, unrelenting. It embodied the new truth, that technology and will, when fused together, could bend even the strongest doctrines into submission. When the last German defenses crumbled and the war in Europe ended, many Hellcats were quietly retired. They had done their job and vanished just as swiftly as they had appeared. But their legacy endured. In every armored vehicle that came after, in every design that valued movement over mass, intelligence over intimidation. The tank destroyer doctrine may have faded, but the spirit of the Hellcat lived on, in speed, precision, and the art of striking first. Years later, in museums and memorials you can still see one. Its olive paint faded, its tracks rusted, but its shape unmistakable. Stand before it long enough, and you might almost hear it again. The low growl of its radial engine, the rush of air as it charged into battle, the faint echo of courage in motion. For the men who fought in it, and for those who faced it, the M18 Hellcat was more than metal. It was a shadow of history itself, swift, relentless, and unforgettable, and somewhere, deep in the archives of time, preserved in the fading ink of field reports and war diaries, lies the truth that those who were there already knew. On the day the German tank crews saw the shadow of the M18 Hellcat for the first time, they also saw the future, a future where speed, ingenuity, and courage would decide the fate of nations. The war's end did not silence the echoes of that first encounter. For the men who had faced the M18 Hellcat, whether from within its thin steel shell or from the turret of a German panzer, the memory became a ghost that followed them long after the guns went quiet. In quiet towns across Europe, long after the smoke cleared, farmers plowing the fields would still unearth the remnants of that battle: twisted metal, charred track links, a fragment of an engine plate stamped M18. To them, these were just relics of a war that had passed. But to the soldiers who had seen it in motion, each piece was a fragment of a legend, a machine that had turned the tide not through brute strength, but through audacity and movement. When historians in later decades tried to measure the Hellcat's contribution, they struggled to find the right language. The statistics were clear: thousands of enemy tanks destroyed, miles of ground gained, countless soldiers saved by its speed. But the true power of the M18 lay not in the numbers. It lay in how it made men feel. For the Germans, it was the first time they realized that steel and armor were no longer enough to guarantee survival. For the Americans, it was proof that courage could be engineered, that a few men, with the right machine, could rewrite the rules of battle. In museums today, visitors often look at the M18 and wonder how something so light, so small, could have faced the beasts of German industry, the tigers, the panthers, the elephants. They touch its thin armor, peer into its open turret, and question how anyone could have fought in such a fragile thing. What they cannot feel through the cold steel is what those crews carried inside. The unspoken belief that survival came not from hiding behind armor, but from moving faster than fear itself. They didn't need invincibility. They needed nerve, and they had it in abundance. For the German tankers, the first glimpse of a Hellcat often came too late. They would see the flash of its muzzle, hear the sharp crack echo through the trees, and by the time they turned their turrets, the Hellcat would already be gone, relocated, hidden, waiting for its next strike. To the men inside those panzers, it was as though the enemy had become invisible. One veteran decades later said softly in an interview, "It was like being hunted by the wind." That was the legacy of the M18 Hellcat, not just in what it destroyed, but in what it represented: the evolution of warfare from might to movement, from domination to deception. It was the first whisper of a new kind of combat, one that would shape the wars to come, where speed, intelligence, and precision would matter more than weight and armor. The lessons learned in those foggy fields of Lorraine would echo into the jet age, into the design of modern tanks, and into the very heart of how armies thought about battle. Even now, in documentaries and old film reels, when the Hellcat rolls across the screen, light glinting off its turret, its radial engine roaring, there's something haunting about it. You can almost feel the ghosts of its crew, Young men with faces streaked in oil and dust, eyes fixed on the horizon, hearts pounding as they raced toward the unknown. You can imagine the German crews on the other side, gripping the controls of their Tigers, scanning the mist, realizing that for the first time, the battlefield no longer belonged to them. In the final months of the war, as Germany collapsed and the Allies closed in, the M18 was still there, fast, relentless, and unyielding. It hunted retreating armor through shattered towns and open plains. It covered infantry, cut off convoys, and outflanked positions thought untouchable. But behind every victory there was the heavy silence of loss. For every Hellcat that returned, there was one that didn't. The price of speed was exposure. The cost of courage was everything. Many of those young men never made it home, and their names remain etched only in after-action reports and faded letters. When peace finally came, the survivors went home carrying invisible scars. Some spoke of the Hellcat with pride, others with sorrow. A few never spoke of it at all. But all of them understood one truth, that in those moments when the world was on fire, they had been part of something larger than themselves. They had seen what innovation could do when combined with courage. They had seen the face of change racing through the fog at 55 miles per hour, and for the German soldiers, the memory of that shadow never faded. Years later, when they met their former enemies in peace, they spoke of that day, the day they first saw the impossible, the day they realized that even the most powerful machines could be outwitted by a faster mind. The Hellcat was more than a tank destroyer. It was a teacher, a reminder that every empire built on fear would one day meet something faster, leaner and braver than itself. So when you stand today in front of that rusted hull, somewhere in a museum or a forgotten field, listen closely. You might hear the faint echo of an engine, the roar of defiance that once cut through Europe's darkness. You might see, just for a moment, a blur of motion in the corner of your mind, the shape of something swift and unstoppable. That is the spirit of the Hellcat, not just a machine of war, but a symbol of the human will to move forward, no matter how thin the armor, no matter how great the danger. And perhaps that is why, all these years later, the name still carries weight. The Germans feared it. The Americans revered it. History remembers it. Because once, in the chaos of a world at war, when men faced steel with steel and courage was measured in seconds, there was a moment, a single, fleeting moment, when a shadow crossed the battlefield. And every man who saw it, on both sides, knew what it meant. The war was changing. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Hellcat was already gone. Years passed, and Europe began to rebuild itself from ashes. The fields that once echoed with the thunder of engines turned quiet again, green with crops instead of smoke. The roads where the M18 Hellcat once raced now carried the laughter of children who would never know the fear their fathers had felt. Yet beneath the soil the scars of war remained. Fragments of shell casings, shattered armor plates, the ghosts of battles fought in silence and fury. And somewhere in that silence, if you listen closely enough, you can still feel it. The faint vibration of a distant engine that once changed everything. The M18 Hellcat became more than a war machine. It became a testament to a nation's spirit, to the belief that ingenuity and courage could stand against overwhelming odds. It proved that wars were not won solely by who had the thickest armor or the largest guns, but by those who dared to think differently, who used speed as strength and unpredictability as defense. It was an American answer to a European storm, a machine that reflected the restlessness and resilience of the men who built it and the soldiers who drove it through hell and back. In the archives of history, where battle reports and war diaries rest in quiet drawers, there are notes scribbled by trembling hands, fragments of fear and awe. One reads, "We were not prepared for what we saw today." Another simply says, "It moved faster than any tank should." These are not just words. They are confessions from those who saw something new, something they could not fully understand. The shadow of the Hellcat was not just a machine. It was the future rushing at them before they could react. Decades later, military historians studying those encounters still pause at the same thought. How a vehicle so lightly armored could instill so much dread in an army that once believed itself untouchable. The answer lies in more than design. It lies in philosophy. The Germans believed power came from invincibility. The Americans learned that survival came from movement, from daring to stay just out of reach. The Hellcat was the embodiment of that philosophy, a living contradiction that defied fear through motion. Even today, when veterans gather and speak of those days, their voices soften at the mention of it. The German survivors recall the terror of hearing an engine that wasn't supposed to be there, a sound that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The American veterans remember the feeling of the wind hitting their faces as they raced into battle with nothing but speed to protect them. For both, the memory is the same. The blur, the flash, the silence that followed. At the end of it all, when the guns had gone quiet and the world began to breathe again, the Hellcat returned home. Some were scrapped, their metal melted into piece. Others were displayed as relics of a bygone era. But a few remained, their engines still able to start, their tracks still ready to turn. And when they do, when the old radial engine coughs to life and that deep growl fills the air, every man who hears it feels something ancient stir inside. Respect, fear, remembrance. Because the M18 Hellcat was never just a tank destroyer. It was the whisper of a changing world. It was the moment when innovation overcame arrogance, when courage met technology, and when the balance of power shifted forever. It was proof that sometimes the most fragile armor hides the strongest will, and so the legend endures, in the pages of history, in the minds of soldiers, and in the still air of every battlefield it once crossed. The Germans called it a ghost. The Americans called it victory. But history remembers it as a shadow, the shadow that moved faster than fear, that struck harder than doubt, and that disappeared before anyone could catch it. That was the moment the German tank crews saw the shadow of the M18 Hellcat for the first time. The moment they realized that even the strongest machines can be outmaneuvered by a faster idea. The moment the future arrived, quiet, unseen, unstoppable. And in the silence that followed, the battlefield belonged not to those who stood still, but to those who dared to move.